Hello, I'm Mr. McBrien, and this is SPH3U, Gravity and Freefall. Today we're going to talk about acceleration due to Earth's gravity. And of course, this is something with which we're all rather familiar. None of you so much as me. The way that a body performs in gravity has been a subject of a fair amount of controversy for thousands of years. It was really only with Galileo that we came to understand how gravity works and the fact that it acts essentially on every object in essentially the same way. So when we talk about acceleration due to gravity, any object, at least initially, will experience acceleration of 9.8 meters per second squared downward. And this is such a fundamental number that we even give it its own term. We call it g. 9.8 meters per second squared down. It may seem counterintuitive, but even objects that are going up are experiencing this acceleration. So as they're moving upward, assuming that they aren't being propelled by something like a rocket, they accelerate while traveling up. And so that means they begin to slow down, and then eventually they change direction, begin falling, and then gravity speeds them up. And this will be a fundamental concept that we're going to use over and over again in projectile motion in the next week. Okay, and what was controversial? The big controversy was the idea that your mass doesn't matter, that we all accelerate the same way downward, regardless of our mass. And this really wasn't intuitive to people before Galileo. So he hypothesized that in the absence of air friction, a hammer and a feather would fall at the same rate. And eventually we got to prove this. So feel free to pause this movie and go to YouTube and have a look at the video of the hammer and feather dropping on the moon. And you see that they do indeed fall at the same rate, provided, of course, that you believe that we actually went there. Okay, so why on earth do a hammer and a feather fall at different rates? Well, the answer is one slowed by atmospheric drag much more than the other. And it's worth actually having a quick discussion about drag. You won't be tested on this, but we can see that the reason why drag is so much greater on the feather than it is on the hammer. So the drag force is a function of the density of the atmosphere, obviously the same for the hammer and the feather. The relative speed of the object, again, the same, but we can revisit that speed in a second. The area of the object, and there's where we get into something interesting, and the drag coefficient. And so it's those two terms that cause the feather to slow down so much quicker. But notice that drag is proportional to the square of the speed of the object. This is an interesting point, because what that means is when those objects are moving very, very slowly, they actually fall at the same rate. So if we measured the rate of falling of a feather and a hammer right at the very beginning of the experiment, they would fall at the same rate. Then, as they speed up, the friction term takes over and begins to affect their relative rates. And one special term is worth discussing briefly in sharp contrast to this movie. For any object in atmosphere, eventually their drag equals the force due to gravity, and the object will stop accelerating, and that's termed terminal velocity. That's when drag equals force due to gravity. And every object has a terminal velocity. A human being will eventually reach equilibrium, falling at about 190 kilometers per hour. A human with a parachute, about a tenth of that, so 18 kilometers per hour. And a dandelion seed, 0.5 meters per second. Something worth noting is that that terminal velocity concept means that any organism smaller than a mouse essentially can't die of a fall. So terminal velocity is slow enough for those creatures due to the fact that their mass and surface area ratio is so much larger. Surface area to mass is so much larger for those creatures than for us, that their terminal velocity is much slower, and a fall will not kill a mouse. So a couple of interesting little snippets. The free fall record was set in 1960 by Joe Kittinger. He broke the sound barrier falling from a high altitude balloon. So why did he not hit terminal velocity so much quicker? Well, that we go back to our drag term, and the air is so much thinner up there that he could break the sound barrier. And many of you will be aware that his record was finally broken a few years ago by Felix Baumgartner, jumping from a higher height, and of course the air was thinner, and he reached 1,357 kilometers per hour. Of course, neither of them have anything on Vesna Vulović, who fell out of an airplane over the Czech Republic, and she fell through the roof of a barn and actually survived falling from about 10 kilometers in a remarkable feat. Okay, so we talked a little bit about g-forces, and we mentioned that acceleration due to gravity has its own term. So 9.8 meters per second squared, we can call that 1g as a non-SI unit. And we can convert back and forth between those terms. So 49 meters per second squared, we can say that's 5 g's. So the human body isn't real good with accelerations. We can typically handle about 5 g's before we pass out when we're in an upright position. And interestingly, certainly this is a comment on the human condition. What do? We run out and design a machine for recreation that'll put us close to that level of blackout. Now, we can manage a higher acceleration in proper conditions. So we can put jet pilots into G-suits and teach them how to strain their muscles to keep blood back in the brain, to keep putting blood back in the brain, and stay at least nominally conscious up to 9 Gs. However, turn someone upside down, and they're not going to handle nearly the same level of acceleration. So upside down, we tend to pass out in the -2 to -3 G range, and we have the pleasant experience of having capillaries in our eyes bursting. contrast, lying down or acceleration perpendicular to the spine is more tolerable for human beings. We can actually manage about 17 Gs being lying on our backs effectively, or 12 Gs in the opposite direction. If any of you are looking to set a record, I wouldn't recommend it. Back when they were doing a lot of experiments around these kinds of things, Colonel John Stapp actually was in a rocket sled and experienced 46.2 Gs. I doubt he was very comfortable during that. And unintentionally notable is David Purley, who crashed his Formula One racing car, and they've estimated that he experienced 178 Gs over 66 seconds. So certainly a remarkable feat, one that I don't want to duplicate. But we encounter G-forces every day. So when we're coughing, our bodies have adapted to actually put us under about 3.5 Gs in coughing, and sneezing nearly as much. Now, what about the case of reduced G-forces? Well, those are a lot less common, of course. We experience them anytime we jump off of anything. We experience free fall, 0 Gs, or weightlessness, because there's nothing pushing against us. And generally that doesn't feel very comfortable. The only time we can see anything more than the few seconds we get from an amusement ride, we need to essentially head into space. At any rate, we'll do some more investigation of acceleration due to